Racism, written by Derek Morris, narrated by Aidan Baumann. All rights reserved. Chapter 1, Introduction. The close connection between slavery and capitalism, and therefore between racism and capitalism, gives the lie to those who insist that the death of slavery has just come. Right before the Civil War, the South was more dependent on slavery than it was 50 or 100 years earlier. Slavery continued as long as it was profitable, and as long as it was lucrative for the world's wealthiest and most well-bred men. From the standpoint of industrial capitalism, slave labor was inefficient. This is demonstrated by the contrast between urban North and Confederacy. As capitalism grew, slave labor became less required. For example, leaders of the biggest industrial capitalists in Britain in the 18th and 19th century called for an end to the slave trade and even abolition. This was not because commercial capitalists were opposed to slavery, but because they didn't like the degree to which planters received favorable government policies for them. The British Parliament passed a legislation banning slavery in the years 1807 and 1833. The Civil War ended segregation in the United States, which dealt a huge blow to prejudice. Yet it was not prejudice itself that was eliminated. On the contrary, just as racism was developed to justify colonial slavery, so racism was refashioned as an ideology. It no longer justified blacks' enslavement, but justified blacks' second-class status as wage laborers and sharecroppers. Even at the turn of the last century, colonial rhetoric was refashioned to justify imperialist conquest. Racism acted as a plausible excuse when a handful of competing world powers fought to split the globe into colonial preserves for cheap raw materials and labor. Now, the vast majority of people of the world were portrayed as inferior races, unable to determine their future. Slavery disappeared, but racism remained a means of justifying the U.S., various European powers, and later Japan's enslavement of millions of people. Racism still remained one of the key forms of capitalist elite used to separate blacks and white workers. Karl Marx commented on a similar divide in Britain between English and Irish workers, contrasting it to the split in the U.S. between blacks and poor whites. Each industrial and commercial center in England now has a working class divided into two hostile groups, proletarians of England and proletarians of Ireland. As a rival, the average English worker hates the Irish worker, who reduces his standard of living. He considers himself a part of the dominant nation in contrast to the Irish worker, and thus becomes an agent of his country's aristocrats and capitalists against Ireland, thereby increasing their control over himself. He cherishes against the Irish workers' political, financial, and national biases. The stance towards him is almost the same as that of the, quote, bad whites in the former U.S. slave states toward the, quote, niggers. Artificially, this antagonism is kept alive and exacerbated by the newspapers, the pulpit, the comic articles, in short, by all means available to the ruling classes. This antagonism, despite its organization, is the secret of impotence of the English working class. Marx outlined the principal sources of racism under modern capitalism in his famous passage on the antagonism between English and Irish workers in Britain in the late 19th century. Capitalism fosters competition among employees by its definition. Bosses take advantage of this in two ways. First, intentionally fostering divisions among workers. Second, in appealing to racist ideology. Workers are forced to compete for jobs, affordable housing, school admission, credit, and etc. As capitalism restructures, it replaces employees with lower-paid jobs with computers and higher-paid employees. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, U.S. capitalists used the surplus of cheap labor immigrants generated to replace unskilled employees with professional, generally white, indigenous workers, quote, triggering a nativistic backlash among craft workers. Today, consolidation in U.S. manufacturing leaves many U.S. workers vulnerable to nationalist demands to, quote, protect their jobs against low
Sample complete. Ready to continue?